The Brussels Report podcast.
Welcome to a new episode of the Brussels Report podcast. My name is Pieter Cleppe. I'm the editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport.eu. And I'm very happy that we have today here Pelle Christy Geertsen, who's a Danish national. He's a real Brussels bubble insider. He has been working in the European Parliament between 2005 and 2014, but is really already active in EU politics since 1997 in Denmark. And now, since 2014, he's the managing director of the Brussels strategy consultancy Euraffex. So, very welcome, Pelle.
Thank you.
Today, we are going to discuss the European Parliament. Myself, I'm not a big fan of the EP, even if I think the original idea is actually quite good. It's to have a democratically elected body that is supposed to scrutinize EU decision making. Now, in my humble view, the EP is not actually a check on the EU machine. It's more like an extra motor, because every time it wants to encourage the EU and the Commission to spend even more or to regulate even more fervently. So while the EP has also, I think, not been a great check on a lot of the waste and financial mismanagement that is visible for years and years when it comes to EU spending. Not to speak, of course, of the EU's own or the European Parliament's own problematic spending. It's extra pension fund it has in Luxembourg. It's the more than €4,000 MEPs receive on their personal bank account that they don't have to specify what they spend it on. Many of them, of course, interpret that as an extra salary, and I can go on and on and on about that institution. But nevertheless, it's actually a very interesting institution, and some important developments are happening between now and Christmas, and that's why I'm delighted to have Pelle here to discuss this more in detail. Now, Pelle, the first big issue is that the current president of the European Parliament is going to be, or maybe replaced, right? So maybe you can tell a bit more about that process and the potential contenders.
Yes, indeed, Peter. The thing is, we're heading towards the European Parliament midterms, and we call it the midterms, even if, of course, there are no actual elections like we see in the US. Nonetheless, the midterms are a very important part of the European Parliament cycle, because it's where we change the president and vice presidents of Parliament and also of all of the committees. And the elections of the president is the most visible part. And traditionally, it's been, switching place between a conservative and a socialist, conservative and a socialist, socialist and conservative. And going back to 79, there have only been two diversions from this, when there have been liberal presidents of parliament, and each have been about 20 years apart. And it's almost 20 years ago since we last had a president that wasn't a conservative or a socialist in one form or the other.
All right, and tell me, like, who you think is gonna gain the top job?
Well, that's a very good question. It's some of us geeks have been following it for a while, because in theory, like so many times before, the deal should have been done. At the beginning of this term, there was a clear deal. First, the socialist takes it, and then the EPP takes it. And the plan was to hand over the presidency to Manfred Weber, the leader of the EPP group. Now, things didn't happen, and it's an open secret in parts of Brussels that the current president, Sassoli, was interested in staying on, something that has only been done once before by Martin Schulz, who was incidentally also a socialist MEP. And that would, of course, mean breaking the agreement with the EPP. And some people were then wondering, why is Manfred Weber, who was designated to be the next president, why is he not reporting out that, of course, he's running and expecting to take it? And then very late this summer, in September, Weber, the EPP leader, declared that he was not available for the position, but also that the presidency of the European Parliament, belongs to the EPP in his views. Something that garnered rather strong reactions, including from the Greens, who said that the position doesn't belong to anyone but is a democratic choice. So right now we stand in a situation where everybody expects the current president Sassoli to run again. And eyes are on the EPP to say, well, who will you run? And there are different rumors. Some people, of course, say Roberta Metsola from Malta. Others are pointing maybe to people like David Lega from Sweden, because he's been seen co-signing a lot with Weber lately. And there can be others. And the EPP might only decide this by the end of November, who their candidate will be, and the elections are in December. So of course, we could say which one of those two will garner support, but the real question is, it might be that none of them can gather the support. Now, Sassoli wouldn't try to run again if he didn't think he stood an above good chance of being re-elected, but the EPP also wouldn't react like they did if they don't think they could marshal the votes. So we don't know. Traditionally, in these situations, we might also expect candidates from other groups like the Greens, ECR, and the big question is, of course, if Renew Europe will finally put forward a candidate or not. I say finally because in theory they're part of the big compromise and would not, as such, be expected to run. But if the compromise falls apart, A, they might put a candidate forth, and why wouldn't they? And B, as part of the compromise, Guy Verhofstadt was supposed to have been the president of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And of course, he didn't get that position. So they could also claim that they are entitled to break the compromise. So who will be the president of parliament? It's a very good question. I think first we need to see who might the candidates be. And that's important because if we're running an old man against an old man, it comes down to maybe clear party lines. But as soon as we mix it up, there are people already pushing for a woman to lead parliament, and it's 20 years ago since we last had a female president, so that's long overdue. There's also push from some groups that maybe it shouldn't be a socialist or a conservative this time, which would certainly make it very interesting to observe. And the reason it matters is because it speaks to us about the dynamics in parliament. The real reason this matters is not the name or even the party color of the person who happens to preside over parliament. The real reason it matters is that it tells us something about the strength and interconnectedness of the political group that wins and their ability to create ad hoc alliances.
Okay, and on top of that, apparently a whole number of other jobs need to be filled in, right? So perhaps we may see, let's say, a grand horse trading exercise where everything will be linked with everything, and the three groups, the EPP, the SND, and Renew Europe, that are basically forming the majority, may just distribute these jobs amongst each other.
Yes, and traditionally that's what's been happening, that there have been a big agreement on who gets to be president when and how to distribute or redistribute the positions. And that carries down to who gets to chair which committee, who gets to be the vice chairs in which order. And traditionally, because it's calculated based on the Hond, when in the heydays of the EPP and SND, when they were more than 65% of parliament, they could pretty much dictate the terms, and they could even choose, even if both of them were entitled to most of the committee spots, they could also decide and get first rights on the committees they preferred to chair and keep their political opposition away. Now, again, we don't know exactly how this will go, and we know that, well, the president fight may or may not rattle these alliances, and that will be very interesting to observe how it escalates into the committee chairs. But we also know that when the ECR lost a committee chair because she defected to the Renew Europe, they were expected to be handed back the committee chair position as is normal, but Renew Europe and others resisted this. And of course, that is interesting in this context, not because ECR alone is strong enough to do something, but in a situation where alliances need to be built and extra vote needs to be attracted, it might not be wise to antagonize a group that holds still an interesting proportion of the European Parliament. And to put it in context, the EPP cannot gather a center-right alliance with enough votes without the support of the entire ECR, as well as the Hungarian members they kicked out.
Okay, and specifically, what kind of chairmanships or vice chairmanships are up for replacing them?
Well, all of the committees in the European Parliament needs their chairs and their vice chairs
Okay.
confirmed or changed. And this again, I mean, if you're as geeky as me, it's super interesting. Not just for the names, but because even if the Foreign Affairs Committee remains in the hands of the EPP, it's interesting if it's McAllister that stays or not, because it tells us something about the internal priorities, but also the internal ups and downs of balances of power within the different political groups. And sometimes you see rising stars and people that were handed certain amounts of influence, and then somehow their group decides to reassign somebody else. And of course, if a group suddenly grows or reduces in size, this also impacts the overall composition of committee leadership.
All right, and then the other development on the right side of the parliament, you mentioned Fidesz. They left the EPP, and there has been an initiative, an attempt, or there's an ongoing attempt to create a so-called supergroup, which would basically gather most of the members of ID, apparently without the German AfD. And a number of parties of the ECR, together with Fidesz party of Orban, which would sort of result in a grand eurosceptic right-wing populist group. We haven't heard all that much anymore. It seems to me that this is definitely a project that is struggling. So, what is your opinion on this? Have you heard more?
Well, this is what I like to refer to as the never-ending story. Because every once in a while we hear stories pop up about this potential supergroup that can pop up and can disrupt everything. And even when the UK was still member, there was rumors that what if UKIP joins and they will do their best to disrupt EU politics. The thing is, it might happen, and there's always the potential, but it's been predicted many times before without happening. That's one thing. The other thing is we know that the supergroup will be limited in size because even ID and ECR combined is still not the largest group in Parliament. Far from it. And not everyone, like you point out, AfD, but there are several ECR members that would be expected to not join a group like that and maybe join EPP or others instead. So that's the other side of it. Now, the most important side is that even if we play along and say we will have the super group, I tend to view it more as something that's convenient for certain groups like the Greens and Renew Europe to use to emphasize the need for internal coherence rather than an actual threat. And I know we've seen stories that, oh my God, what if they try to block EU policy, and what if they have all these votes? And the problem a supergroup with the different parties we know might be part of it, the problem a supergroup would have are twofold. One is they don't agree. Because if you take the parties of ID and ECR, there are plenty of reasons they're not together already. They don't agree on economic policy and austerity. That's been sticking stones, be dividing lines earlier.
Yes.
They don't agree at all on the question of free trade versus protectionism. There are parties with very conflicting views. They don't agree on foreign policy. Famously, of course, the relationship with Russia, but also the view on China and many other countries. So they can't agree on money. They can't agree on trade and protectionism. They can't agree on foreign policy. Even on energy policy, the parties in the different groups are also divided on how green or not green they are. And some view renewable energies as a source of energy security. Others are fighting wind turbines. So they really don't agree. And that leads me to the second part. Even if they join and form a group, they are only as powerful as the votes they can muster. Because when you sit in Parliament, and the real influence you have is many times in the committee works, not in the plenary. And in the committee works, it can be difficult to see exactly what goes on. But when you are negotiating actual legislation, which is where some people could fear their influence, you are worth exactly as much as the amount of votes you can guarantee. And one of the problems that a supergroup might have is that since they don't agree, they might represent, let's say, 120 members and be larger than Renew Europe. But that doesn't matter if a shadow rapporteur or even a rapporteur can only promise support from 30 members. Then they're only given that sizable weight in the negotiations, which means they would account for less than the left group or the Greens.
Yes.
Now, adding to this is the complexity, of course, that there are also several political groups who don't want to support anything coming from the ID group. And if that was to be carried over to a super group, it would also mean, yeah, but even if they manage to represent a fifth or a sixth of the European Parliament, does it matter if people don't want to use their votes? What we've seen in the past is that the ECR group has a lot of influence on certain issues because there are people who rely on their votes, for instance, to get Ursula von der Leyen confirmed as Commission President. And in any negotiations, you can demand something in return. Now, if people don't want to use their votes because they're combined with people associated with Le Pen and others, you can question what is the actual impact and will they manage to reduce influence by becoming more?
Yes. Well, something else then. I saw you wrote an article for our friends at EU Observer on on sexism and the selection of the European Parliament president, basically describing that the European Parliament loves to talk about diversity here and diversity there, but at the end of the day, they don't always apply it that fervently on themselves, do they?
No, it's a little bit curious that we may recall that when the von der Leyen Commission was appointed, Parliament made it a sticking point. There needs to be X percent of women in the college, or the whole college will not be approved by Parliament, and that was a fight. Certain countries had to be encouraged actively to get position, and it was the same under Juncker. And when Juncker was president, he clearly said that if you send me a qualified woman, you get a lot, and if you don't heed my call and send me an old man, you won't get any portfolio of note. And Parliament actively encourages this. Yet, when looking at the Parliament president, I mean, there have been 16 different presidents of Parliament since the elections in '79, and all but two of them have been men. And the last time a woman was elected to head the European Parliament was in the last millennium, because it was in 1999, and it was the Frenchman Nicole Fontaine. And the woman that headed Parliament before that was 20 years before, in '79, when it was Simone Weil. So the diversity or respect for gender composition that Parliament is normally fond of has not been a priority, it seems, when it comes to filling the presidency of the European Parliament. That's not to say there aren't women who have run, because there are plenty of women and plenty of people with a much more diverse background. But it just doesn't seem to have been a factor. And that may be because it tends to be a stitch up or a compromise between some of the groups who agree, and then the members have to react. If the dividing lines are clearer and if there are more candidates, then it's interesting if gender, for instance, will be a real factor, especially because the vote is secret. So nobody knows who the MEPs actually voted for in the parliamentary president elections.
It actually reminds me of how the European Parliament is quite keen on what you could call tax transparency. They're always railing about this. I mean, we just had the so-called Pandora leaks, so I would not be surprised if a number of MEPs will once again try to use this for new initiatives to impose new requirements on people and on businesses to disclose to the authorities what they own, how much money they make, etc., etc. And of course, there always definitely a majority in the European Parliament is viciously opposed to tax havens, both inside and outside of the EU, and they, for example, then single out countries like Luxembourg. But in practice, as I mentioned, the European Parliament has this second pension fund, which is no longer available for new MEPs to join. This was a pension fund set up once for MEPs that were not paid a pension by their member state. But what happened is that many MEPs that did get a pension from their member state also joined that pension scheme. Now, there's many things wrong with it, but one of the problems is that it is secretly structured in Luxembourg. So you would expect, if they are generally so concerned with secretive, legal schemes, you would expect them to start with themselves. But this gets very, very little attention. And even in the ranking of MEPs that I published with Brussels Report in May, one of the votes was actually on that pension scheme. The question or the sort of the resolution that was submitted to MEPs was very simple. It was, do you think that if this pension scheme, if it suffers a loss, do you think taxpayers should pay for it, or the former MEPs that once were a member of the EP and are still enjoying those pension payments, should they pay for it themselves? And then I think it was a majority, but at least many MEPs blatantly, openly voted to support the idea that if there was a misinvestment and there was an investment gap, that taxpayers had to bail out this arrangement. So I mean, just the hypocrisy is just mind-boggling, to be honest. And it's I think it's interesting to hear you make the overview of how they also aren't very well when it comes to promoting diversity.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is, of course, it's complex, and diversity is many things. You can see it's also that if you look at all of the committee chairs in the European Parliament, there's only 4 of them, which is less than 25%, that are from Central and Eastern Europe. And that's now we are quite a long time since the large enlargement. And it's interesting that many groups don't put forward Central and Eastern European candidates, and those that do all tend to be center-right. Renew Europe, ECR, and EPP, which is an interesting it's an interesting pattern, and there are many things to be said. Now, I'm a lot more fond of the European Parliament than you are, Peter. But just on the issue of
That's
taxes,
not
it's
very hard.
interesting. It's interesting that you bring up the pension fund, because it's an area they actually have influence on. Whereas the listings of tax havens, it's normal that members of the European Parliament are very vocal on this, and you will hear them be vocal again this week in Parliament. And the reason it's normal is that they don't have direct influence. Taxation is still predominantly a member state competence. So every time the EU updates its lists of tax havens, MEPs react quite vocally. And one of the things they point out is that they want influence on it, but they don't have it. Not even the Commission dictates the tax havens list. It's done by the EU member states. And it's a political decision. And I know some of the critique points is also that EU's tax haven list does not identify EU countries, even if they, using the same criteria, should maybe be listed together with non-EU countries. So it's an interesting point, but remember, Parliament doesn't actually have direct influence on most taxation issues. Now, that being said, there are lots of inconsistencies in the way the European Parliament works, and there always is in a political organization. But the opinion piece you refer to was simply to chart out that this is a place where Parliament could show more diversity in many ways, and Parliament has had candidates that were born outside of Europe, running as candidates, people of different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, people with disabilities, and of a much wider geographic spread than currently. Because again, when we look at the presidents of the European Parliament, 25% of them have been German, and then if we add in the next 2, it's France and Spain, and those 3 countries together account for more than 66% of all the past presidents of the European Parliament, which again shows that it's not always maybe as representative as it demands other institutions to be. And given the current debates, it's interesting to see how this will be brought up in the campaign for the president, but also for the committee chairs, because we have seen before Eastern and Central European countries banding together and demanding more influence. But then again, we've also only seen one president of the European Parliament that's from Central and Eastern Europe, and of course that's also quite a while ago.
Yes, and actually talking about Central and Eastern Europe, we had the news yesterday that the Romanian politician Dacian Cholos has been elected the president of USR Plus, and as a result, which is a liberal party, so to speak, in Romania, and as a result, he will step down as the chair of Renew Europe. So maybe that's also worthwhile to discuss, because it sort of, I think, in my view, shows that, I mean, whatever one thinks of the European Parliament, it is some kind of a hub where the politicians of Europe from very different strands come together. And if you make the list of the number of, let's say, influential politicians, both from the left and the right, that have basically passed by not only the Parliament but Brussels in general, the Brussels bubble, I mean, it's quite an important list, right? I mean, of course, we have Nigel Farage, who never was in the UK Parliament, but is probably one of the most influential British politicians of his generation. We have Marine Le Pen, we have Salvini in Italy. I mean, maybe you can
Yeah, but
complete.
you also have maybe much more mainstream and even more
Yes.
well-known politicians. I mean, Sarkozy from France was a member of the European Parliament for a short while. Silvio Berlusconi famously is and also was many years ago a member of the European Parliament. You have lots of former prime ministers and foreign ministers that came more or less directly from Brussels. Um, and Cholos, as you mentioned, is an interesting thing, because it used to be that the European Parliament was the elephant graveyard of European politics. This is where you send politicians as a retirement gift. So there were many with national experience. Then
Yes.
we started to see new talent also, you know, making their careers here. The Denmark's first female prime minister, Thorning Schmidt, was famously married to a UK parliamentarian.
Mhm.
She had her first political mandate in the European Parliament,
Mhm.
for instance, and we can mention many politicians where that was the case. Cholos is interesting because he is in a third category, because he was, of course, also a Romanian commissioner to the EU, and he held government positions at home and then Brussels. So he's this new evolution of kind of commuting back and forth between Brussels and the capital, which is something we might also see even more of. And we also see, I mean, that in itself is interesting. We will see more like it. But we see that it opens career possibilities, and it's no longer like the Danish TV series Borgen famously said not that long ago: in Brussels, nobody can hear you scream.
Yes.
It seems today people can hear you scream. Now, the choice of Chulas is interesting on many levels. It's interesting because it leaves Parliament's third largest group facing quite a bit of a challenge. Who should their next chair be? It also faces the European Parliament as such with a bit of a representational issue, because Chulas, of course, was Central and Eastern European. And if we continue having an EPP group that's run by a German and an SND that's run by via Spanish, if the third largest group then switches to old Europe, so to speak, the Greens are run by old Europe, the lefts are run by old Europe, then there is only the ECR left with a co-chair from Central Eastern Europe. So they might also, switch the internal geographical balance. And of course, I mean, anybody that follows Renew Europe knows that it will be interesting to see who in this party or who in this group gets to be the new president, which wing of the group will claim it, and not least at which price. Because as with the president of parliament and all the committee chairs, it's
Yes.
not just who gets the position, it's what is the price they have to pay.
All right, something to look out for. I think we covered a lot of ground, so that was actually very interesting. Thank you very much, Pelle, for shining some light on the European Parliament, and of course we continue to follow it with great interest. Let's stay in touch, and I look forward also to more comment pieces of yours for Brussels report. So
Thank
thank
you,
you.
Peter, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It's always nice to let out my inner European Parliament geek.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.
The Brussels Report podcast.